He is broken. Those words hit Elena like a punch to the stomach. She stood frozen near the copier, watching a 7-year-old boy curl into a ball under a mahogany table. The office was chaotic. The CEO's fiancée sighed loud enough for everyone to hear. Some children just belong in institutions. It was a Tuesday morning, and the boy wasn't broken. He was just thirsty. Elena was terrified of being fired, but she couldn't watch him suffer. She did something forbidden. She crawled under the table, and as the CEO walked in, expecting to find a disaster, he witnessed a miracle that brought him to his knees. But what happened next didn't just save his son. It started a scandal that would threaten to destroy them both. Now, before we dive into the moment that changed everything, if you've ever felt the pain of being misunderstood, or if you believe kindness is a language everyone speaks, hit that like button, and if you're new here, subscribe. Okay, let's go back to that table, the silent boy, and the billionaire was watching from the doorway. Sterling Associates was a place where silence was a luxury item, one that few could afford. The firm's headquarters, a monolith of glass and steel piercing the city skyline, was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the traffic below, reducing the chaotic world to a silent, moving tapestry. But inside, on the 25th floor, the air was thick with the aggressive clatter of mechanical keyboards, the ringing of phones, and the hushed, terrified whispers of junior architects praying their blueprints wouldn't be shredded. In this ecosystem of sharp angles and even sharper egos, Elena was nothing more than a blur in the background. She was the ghost who refilled the espresso machine before the beans ran out. She was the shadow who silently organized the color-coded files in the archive room while the executives argued over million-dollar contracts. At 24, Elena possessed a degree in design and a mind full of brilliant ideas, but to the high-powered suits walking past her desk, she was simply the girl, not Elena. Just a faceless entity who fetched the dry cleaning and vanished when actual business was being discussed. But today, the pristine, calculated atmosphere of the office was shattered. It didn't start with a construction crisis or a market crash. It started with the distinct, guttural scream of a child. The elevator doors slid open with a cheerful ding that felt mocking given the scene that followed. Damien Sterling, the CEO, strode out. Damien was a man who usually commanded the room with a single, icy glance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in charcoal suits that cost more than Elena's entire year of rent. His eyes were usually focused, intense, and unreadable. But today, the ice was cracking. Holding his hand, or rather, trying desperately to pull away from it, was a small boy with messy dark hair and tear-stained cheeks. This was Leo. The office rumor mill called the CEO's 7-year-old son difficult, a polite corporate code for unmanageable. But the truth was far more heartbreaking. Leo was deaf, and in a world that refused to slow down or look him in the eye, he was drowning. Damien looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of wealth could hide. He dragged the resisting boy toward the reception area, his grip firm but careful. "Just sit here, Leo. Please," Damien pleaded, his voice tight with a mixture of stress and public embarrassment. He pointed to a sleek, uncomfortable leather chair. "Daddy has a meeting. A very important meeting. Just color." He thrust a high-end tablet into the boy's hands, offering a digital distraction. But Leo didn't want the tablet. He pushed it away with a violent shove, sending the expensive device clattering loudly onto the marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in a library. Heads turned instantly. The pristine, polished staff exchanged looks of open annoyance. Vanessa, the vice president, sighed loudly from the doorway of her glass office, rolling her eyes as she crossed her arms. To them, Leo was a brat. He was a distraction. They saw a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because he wasn't getting his way. They didn't see a 7-year-old boy trapped in a glass box of silence, screaming to be heard by a father who didn't know how to listen. Elena stood behind a large monster plant near the break room, clutching a stack of files against her chest to make herself even smaller. She didn't turn away like the others. She watched. She watched as Leo kicked the chair, making a sound that wasn't a word, something raw and frustrated. Damien ran a hand through his perfect hair, ruining the style. "I don't know what you want, Leo," he snapped, his voice fraying at the edges. It wasn't malice. It was the desperation of a father who felt like a failure every single day. The nanny had quit that morning without notice, leaving him no choice but to bring his world into his work. Leo's face turned bright red. He made a repetitive motion with his hand, bringing a cupped fist up to his mouth, and then, receiving no reaction, he threw a toy car across the room. It hit the leg of the receptionist's desk with a thud. The receptionist glared at the child with pure venom. But Elena's eyes narrowed. She replayed the motion in her head, cupped hand to mouth. She looked at the reception desk, where a large, condensation-covered pitcher of ice water sat just out of reach. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't throwing a tantrum because he was bad. He was throwing a tantrum because he was thirsty. He had been signing, drink, to a room full of people who only spoke the language of profit. The tragedy of the moment was suffocating. The most powerful man in the city couldn't understand the simplest, most basic need of the person he loved most. Damien, defeated and late, eventually dragged a sobbing Leo into his massive office and shut the blinds, hiding the shame from his employees. The office returned to its aggressive hum, dismissing the incident instantly. "Someone needs to get that kid under control," a senior architect muttered near Elena, shaking his head. Elena said nothing. She walked back to her desk, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a strange, aching kinship with the boy. She knew exactly what it was like to scream without making a sound. She knew what it was like to be right there, in plain sight, and yet be completely invisible to everyone who mattered. She couldn't intervene. She was a nobody. If she walked into the CEO's office now, she'd be fired before she could open her mouth. But the image of Leo's frantic, cupped hand wouldn't leave her mind. That evening, Elena returned to her tiny studio apartment. It was cluttered with her own sketches, buildings she hoped to design one day, but she pushed them aside. She didn't turn on the TV to zone out. She didn't make dinner. Instead, she opened her battered laptop. The blue glow of the screen illuminated her determined face in the dark room. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before typing, basic sign language for children. The search results flooded in. Videos, diagrams, and tutorials. Elena clicked the first one. A woman on the screen smiled and moved her hands gracefully. "Hello, friend. Hungry, thirsty." Elena watched, mesmerized. She lifted her own hands. They felt clumsy at first, stiff and uncertain. She stood in front of her full-length mirror, the city lights flickering outside her window. She mimicked the woman on the screen. She tapped her chin. She crossed her fingers. She repeated the motion for water, over and over again until her wrist ached and her movements became fluid. She practiced until the clock on her nightstand read 3 a.m. She was exhausted, her eyes burning. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt like she was preparing for a mission. She wasn't just learning a language, she was building a bridge. 1 week later, the storm returned to the 25th floor. The atmosphere in the office was brittle, the air conditioning humming too loudly in the suffocating silence of a Tuesday morning. Damien was sequestered in the main conference room, visible only through frosted glass walls that blurred his figure into a dark, imposing silhouette. He was in the middle of a merger negotiation that would define the next decade of the firm's existence. The stakes were astronomical, the tension palpable even from the hallway. And right in the center of the sleek, minimalist reception area, a disaster was unfolding. Leo was back. But this time, he wasn't screaming. He had gone into full retreat. The boy had crawled underneath a large, decorative mahogany side table in the waiting area, curling himself into a tight, trembling ball. He refused to come out. He had built a fortress of silence amidst the corporate noise, pressing his hands over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut against a world that felt like an assault. Vanessa, the executive VP and Damien's polished, picture-perfect fiancée, clicked her tongue in annoyance. She smoothed the front of her immaculately tailored white dress, checking her reflection in the window before approaching the table. To the casual observer, she looked like a concerned stepmother-to-be. She bent slightly at the waist, careful not to wrinkle her fabric. "Leo," she cooed, her voice pitched high and sugary, a tone designed for an audience rather than a child. "Come out now, sweetie. Daddy is working. You're making a scene." There was no response from the darkness under the table. Leo didn't even open his eyes. Vanessa's smile faltered. She looked around to ensure the receptionist was on the phone, and the junior staff were buried in their screens. Seeing the coast was relatively clear, her posture stiffened. The sweetness evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp hiss. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the sting of a whip. "Listen to me, you difficult little brat. Come out right now, or I will make sure you spend the rest of the day in the car. Do you hear me? You are embarrassing your father." She reached out, her manicured nails grazing his arm to pull him. Leo flinched violently, shrinking back against the table leg, letting out a sharp, fearful sound. Vanessa recoiled as if she had touched something filthy. "Fine," she snapped, standing up and brushing invisible dust from her sleeves. "Stay there. Rot there for all I care." She spun on her heel and marched toward her office, muttering about how boarding school was the only logical solution. Elena had seen it all. She was standing by the copier, a stack of blueprints in her arms, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cruelty of it made her stomach churn. She waited until Vanessa's door clicked shut. She waited until the receptionist turned her back to file a courier slip. This was forbidden. She was a junior assistant. She wasn't paid to handle the CEO's family. In fact, interacting with them was strictly discouraged. But Elena set the blueprints down on a nearby chair. She took a deep breath, checked the hallway one last time, and then did something undignified for a corporate employee. She got down on her hands and knees. Slowly, carefully, Elena crawled under the mahogany table. The space was cramped and dim, smelling of floor wax and old carpet. Leo's eyes snapped open. He looked terrified, shrinking back, expecting another hand to grab him, or another angry face to yell at him. He pulled his knees to his chest, his breath hitching in silent sobs. Elena didn't speak. She didn't say, "It's okay," because she knew those words meant nothing to him. She didn't try to touch him. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, settling into his level. She waited until his tear-filled eyes locked onto hers. She smiled, not a polite, customer service smile, but a genuine, soft expression that reached her eyes. Then, she raised her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she hooked her two index fingers together, interlocking them. "Friend." Leo blinked. The tears stopped flowing for a second. He stared at her hands, then up at her face, stunned. He had never seen a stranger do that. He had never seen anyone in this building use his language. Elena held the pose for a moment, letting him process it. Then she transitioned. She formed a C shape with her right hand and moved it down the center of her chest. "Hungry?" She tilted her head, asking the question with her eyebrows. "Are you hungry?" Leo's mouth fell open slightly. The tension in his small shoulders, which had been tight as wire, suddenly went slack. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off his chest. Someone knew. Someone understood. He wasn't stupid. He was just starving. He eagerly nodded his head, mimicking the sign back to her, his movements clumsy but frantic. "Hungry. Hungry." Elena reached into the pocket of her oversized cardigan. She pulled out a foil-wrapped chocolate chip cookie she had saved from her own lunch. She unwrapped it slowly, making sure he saw what it was, and held it out. Leo hesitated for only a fraction of a second before reaching out and taking it. He took a massive bite, closing his eyes in pure relief. For 5 minutes, they sat there in the dark under the table, the overlooked assistant and the misunderstood heir. Elena watched him eat, singing, "Good?" whenever he looked at her. Leo smiled, a gummy, chocolate-smeared grin that transformed his entire face. He wasn't a monster. He was just a little boy. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open. The sound of deep voices and shuffling papers flooded the hallway. The meeting was over. Elena's eyes widened. She put a finger to her lips, shhh, and then scrambled backward, sliding out from under the table just as the executives began to pour out. She grabbed her blueprints and stood up, smoothing her skirt, her heart racing. She moved quickly back to the photocopier, turning her back to the scene, pretending to work. Damien walked out first, rubbing his temples. He looked braced for impact. He expected to hear screaming. He expected to see his son throwing things or Vanessa looking harried. He scanned the room, dread pooling in his stomach. "Leo?" he called out wearily. To his shock, Leo crawled out from under the table. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He stood up, dusted off his knees, and looked calm, content even. There was a smear of chocolate on his cheek, but he looked up at his father and simply waited. Damien froze. He blinked, looking around the room, baffled. The silence was miraculous. "Leo?" he said again, softer this time. Vanessa materialized instantly from her office, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She saw the calm child and the relieved CEO. She walked briskly over, placing a possessive hand on Leo's shoulder, the same shoulder she had refused to touch moments ago. "There you are," Vanessa said, beaming at Damien. "I told him he needed to calm down if he wanted to see you. I just had to be a little firm with him, darling. You know I have a way with children. It just takes patience." Damien let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. He looked at Vanessa with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Van. I don't know how you did it. I was sure he'd be in mid-meltdown. It's a gift." Vanessa lied smoothly, squeezing Leo's shoulder hard enough that the boy didn't move. Damien stepped forward to pick up his son. As he lifted Leo, his eyes caught something on the floor near the table leg. It was a crinkled silver foil wrapper, a cheap vending machine cookie wrapper. Damien frowned. Vanessa didn't eat carbs. She certainly didn't carry vending machine cookies. He looked at Vanessa, then down at the wrapper, and then scanned the room. His gaze swept over the staff, the receptionist typing, the architects arguing, and the quiet girl with the messy bun by the copier, her back turned to him. He felt a prickle of curiosity, a sense that the narrative didn't quite fit. But the relief was too strong to question it yet. He hugged his son, oblivious to the fact that the true architect of this piece was standing 10 feet away, invisible once again. The interaction under the table changed something fundamental in Elena. It wasn't just sympathy anymore, it was a mission. She couldn't shake the image of Leo's eyes widening when she signed friend. That single spark of connection in his isolated world haunted her. She knew what it meant to be alone in a crowd, and she refused to let him stay there. Elena's life became a blur of exhaustion and determination. Her days at Sterling Associates were grueling marathons of filing, coffee runs, and dodging the condescending remarks of senior architects who treated her like office furniture. By 6 p.m., her feet ached, and her mind was numb. But her day didn't end when she clocked out. Every night she returned to her small apartment, kicked off her shoes, and opened her laptop. The glow of the screen became her only company. While her friends were out at bars or sleeping, Elena was a student again. ASL for beginners, sentence structure, emotional vocabulary. She watched videos at 2x speed, rewinding the difficult parts until her eyes watered. She practiced while brushing her teeth, signing blue, red, and green to her reflection. She practiced on the subway, her hands moving subtly in her lap as she commuted to work, ignoring the strange looks from fellow passengers. Tree, car, happy, sad. Her fingers, once stiff and uncertain, began to develop a rhythm. She bought a second-hand book on sign language grammar and read it during her 10-minute lunch breaks, hiding it under a stack of invoices so her supervisor wouldn't see. She was tired, bone-deep, soul-weary tired. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leo waiting for someone to speak to him. Over the next month, a secret routine developed. Damien brought Leo to the office every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon now, claiming it was a temporary arrangement, while he interviewed new nannies, but the staff whispered that no nanny wanted the job. Elena became strategic. She volunteered for tasks that would take her near the waiting area or the executive wing. She started carrying small things in her pockets, a bouncy ball, a plastic dinosaur, and a pack of colorful stickers. Whenever Damien was pulled into a meeting or Vanessa was busy preening in front of a mirror, Elena would slip over to Leo. "Hey," she would sign, a quick, sharp movement. Leo, who usually sat slumped in a chair staring at the floor, would perk up instantly. His eyes would scan the room until they found her, the lady with the messy bun and the ink-stained fingers. She would drop a small toy on the table next to him. "Dinosaur," she would sign. "Big teeth." "Roar." Leo would giggle, a sound so rare in that office it felt illegal. He would sign back, his small hands copying her. "Roar." They had entire conversations in 30-second bursts. She told him about the pigeons outside the window. He told her about his drawing of a rocket ship. She became his secret interpreter, his only tether to reality in a building that treated him like a piece of broken equipment. He started waiting for her. The receptionist noticed that Leo would sit by the glass doors, watching not for his father, but for the junior assistant with the cardigan. The contrast between this blooming friendship and Damien's home life could not have been starker. That Friday evening, Damien sat across from Vanessa at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. The table was set with white linen and crystal, the atmosphere hushed and expensive. But Damien wasn't tasting his wine. He was staring into the glass, his brow furrowed. "I don't know what to do, Van," he admitted, his voice low. "He's 7. He should be engaging. I tried to talk to him, but he just looks at me like I'm a stranger. I feel like I'm losing him to the silence." Vanessa took a sip of her champagne, her expression perfectly composed but her eyes devoid of warmth. "Darling, you're being too hard on yourself," she said, reaching across the table to pat his hand. Her touch was light and performative. "The reality is, Leo has limitations. We have to be realistic. I've been looking into that boarding school in Switzerland, the one for special needs. They have specialists, Damien. Professionals who deal with this sort of thing." Damien flinched. The suggestion hit him like a physical slap. "He's my son, Vanessa, not a project. I don't want to send him away. I want to know him." "Well," Vanessa sighed, withdrawing her hand and checking her reflection in her knife. "Maybe he's just not capable of that kind of connection. Some children aren't. You need to focus on your legacy, Damien. The firm needs you. Leo needs structure elsewhere." Damien looked at her, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He felt an overwhelming wave of loneliness. He was the CEO of a billion-dollar empire, yet he felt utterly powerless to solve the one problem that mattered. He loved his son desperately, but he felt like he was shouting through a glass wall that was slowly thickening every day. The following Tuesday, the office was buzzing with the chaotic energy of a deadline day. Damien had been in back-to-back video calls since 7 a.m. By 2 p.m., he needed coffee, strong and black. He stepped out of his office, rubbing his neck, walking toward the executive break room at the end of the hall. The hallway was quiet, most staff huddled in the bullpens, but as Damien approached the break room door, he heard a sound that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, not since his wife was alive. Laughter. And not just a chuckle. It was a full, belly-shaking, joyous peal of laughter. It was unmistakably Leo. Damien froze, his hand hovering inches from the door handle. His heart skipped a beat. Leo never laughed like that. Leo screamed. Leo cried. Leo sat in sullen silence. But he didn't laugh. Damien's mind raced. Was Vanessa in there? No, Vanessa was at a spa appointment. Was it the receptionist? No, she was at her desk. The laughter came again, followed by a soft, rhythmic clapping sound. Damien swallowed hard. A mix of confusion and a desperate, fragile hope surged through him. He needed to see who had unlocked his son. He needed to see the miracle. Very slowly, trying not to make a sound, Damien turned the handle and pushed the door open just a crack. Damien pushed the door open just enough to create a sliver of visibility. A narrow window into a world he didn't recognize. The break room was a sterile space, white tiles, stainless steel appliances, and the hum of a refrigerator. But in the center of the room, on the cold linoleum floor, there was warmth. Elena was sitting cross-legged, her expensive cardigan bunched up around her elbows, her messy buns slightly askew. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't rushing to fetch coffee. She was entirely focused on Leo. And Leo. Damien felt his breath hitch in his throat. Leo was alive. The boy was sitting opposite her, his face lit up with an expression of intense concentration and delight. Elena's hands were moving rapidly, gracefully slicing through the air. She touched her forehead, then moved her hands out in an expansive gesture. Then she mimicked a bird taking flight, her fingers fluttering. Leo watched her, his eyes wide and drinking in every movement. Then, he raised his own small hands. He copied the gesture, clumsily, his motor skills still refining the shapes, but the intent was clear. He signed back. Elena gasped, a theatrical, playful sound that made Leo giggle again. She clapped her hands silently, the deaf applause shaking them in the air. Yes. You got it, she signed. Smart boy. Damien stood frozen in the doorway, gripped by a paralysis of awe and devastation. He was witnessing a conversation, a real, two-way conversation. For 7 years, he had assumed Leo's world was a silent void, a place where complex thoughts couldn't reach. He had listened to specialists who spoke about cognitive delays and behavioral barriers. He had listened to Vanessa, who treated Leo like a broken pet. But watching this invisible assistant, this girl whose name he barely remembered, he realized how wrong he had been. Leo wasn't broken. He wasn't slow. He was just waiting for someone to speak his language. The realization hit Damien with the force of a physical blow. Shame, hot and sharp, flooded his chest. He was the CEO of a global empire. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals in 3 languages. He could read a blueprint and see a skyscraper before the ground was broken. But he couldn't tell his own son he loved him. He had never taken the time to learn what this 24-year-old assistant had seemingly mastered in her spare time. He watched as Elena reached out and gently corrected Leo's finger placement. Her touch was tender, devoid of the hesitation or annoyance that most adults showed around his son. She treated him with dignity. Blue, she whispered, mouthing the word as she signed it, pointing to her own blue scarf. Leo signed blue. Then he pointed to the sky outside the window. Yes, the sky is blue. Elena signed back, her face beaming. Damien felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Elena properly for the first time. He had seen her 100 times before, walking past his office, carrying trays, standing in the elevator. But he had never seen her. He realized now that she was beautiful. Not in the polished, manufactured way Vanessa was beautiful. Elena's beauty was soft. It was in the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled at his son. It was in the patience of her posture. It was in the messy, human warmth she radiated in this cold, corporate building. He stood there for 10 minutes. He let his coffee break turn into a vigil. He watched them talk about colors, about animals, about hunger. He saw his son express a preference, no apple, cookie, and saw Elena laugh and negotiate, first apple, then cookie. It was parenting. It was a connection. It was everything he had been starving for. Suddenly, the break room refrigerator cycled off with a loud click. Elena looked up toward the door, her senses alerting her to the possibility of being caught. Damien jerked back instantly. He couldn't be found here. If he walked in now, the dynamic would shatter. She would revert to the terrified employee, and Leo would sense the tension. He needed to preserve this magic, but he also knew he couldn't let it stay a secret in the break room forever. He walked back to his office in a daze. The hallway felt different now. The noise of the phones and the typing seemed trivial compared to the silence he had just witnessed. He entered his massive corner office and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. A text from Vanessa. Dinner at Le Bernardin tonight? I need to discuss the gala seating chart. Damien looked at the screen. The thought of sitting across from Vanessa, hearing her talk about seating charts and boarding schools while sipping vintage wine, suddenly made him feel nauseous. He typed back, cancel dinner. Something came up. He didn't offer an explanation. He sat down in his leather chair and pressed the intercom button. Get me HR. he said, his voice rough. Yes, Mr. Sterling. Is there a problem? His executive secretary asked. No, Damien said, staring at the closed door of the break room down the hall in his mind. I need a file. Bring me the personnel record for the junior assistant, the one with the... He paused. He didn't know her last name. Elena. Elena Rossi, sir? Yes. Elena Rossi. Bring it to me immediately. When the file arrived, Damien spent an hour reading it. He learned she had graduated with honors in design. He learned she had been with the firm for 2 years, consistently receiving, meets expectations, on reviews that were clearly written by managers who didn't care. He saw her photo, a standard ID badge picture where she looked nervous. He closed the file. He had a plan. It was unorthodox. It would cause gossip. Vanessa would hate it. The board might question it. He didn't care. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across the office floor. Elena arrived at 8 a.m., clutching her coffee, ready for another day of invisibility. She settled into her cubicle, turning on her computer. At 8:15 a.m., her desk phone rang. She picked it up. Elena Rossi speaking. Elena. The voice on the other end was the head of HR, sounding clipped and formal. Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his office. Immediately. Elena's stomach dropped. The blood drained from her face. He knows. She thought back to the break room yesterday. Had she stayed too long? Has someone reported her for wasting company time? Playing with the boss's kid? Panic set in. She needed this job. She had rent to pay and student loans to manage. Being fired for unprofessional conduct would ruin her. She stood up, her legs shaking. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep breath, and walked the long, terrifying walk to the CEO's office. She prepared her apology. She prepared to beg. She had no idea that she wasn't walking toward her termination but toward her destiny. The walk to the double oak doors of the CEO's office felt like a march to the gallows. Elena's hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them together to stop the shaking. She knocked, the sound feeble against the heavy wood. Come in. Damien's voice was deep, authoritative, and terrifyingly calm. Elena pushed the door open and stepped onto the plush carpet. The office was enormous, a sanctuary of leather, chrome, and power. Damien stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, looking out at the city he practically owned. Mr. Sterling. Elena started, her voice barely a whisper. I can explain. I know I wasn't at my desk yesterday afternoon, but Damien turned around slowly. To Elena's surprise, his face wasn't twisted in anger. He looked tired, yes, but his eyes, usually so cold and impenetrable, were soft. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit down, Miss Rossi. Elena sat, perching on the edge of the seat like a bird ready to take flight. Damien leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his ankles, breaking the barrier of formality. He looked at her intently, studying her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Where did you learn it? He asked simply. Elena blinked, confused. Learn what, sir? Sign language? Damien said. I saw you in the break room. With Leo. Elena's heart hammered. He had seen. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overstep. I just noticed that Leo was frustrated, and I asked where you learned it. Damien interrupted gently. Did you study it in college? Do you have a deaf family member? Elena looked down at her hands. No, sir. I learned it on YouTube. At night, after work. Damien went still. You learned it for him? He seemed so lonely. Elena admitted, looking up, her fear replaced by a sudden surge of honesty. He was screaming because he was thirsty, Mr. Sterling. No one understood him. I couldn't watch that happen again. The silence that followed was heavy. Damien looked away, a muscle in his jaw twitching. When he looked back, the mask of the CEO was gone. In its place was a father who had been humbled. I have hired the best specialists in the country, Damien said quietly. I have bought the most expensive hearing aids. I have read every book. And yet in 1 month you have gotten more smiles out of my son than I have in 7 years. He took a breath, his voice lowering to a vulnerable register that shocked Elena. He listens to you. He looks at you like you're the only person in the world who makes sense. Elena didn't know what to say. I'm not going to fire you, Elena, Damien said, straightening up. I'm promoting you. Elena's eyes widened. Promoting me? To senior architect? No, Damien said. I need you for something more important than buildings. I want you to be Leo's liaison, his companion. When he is here in the office, your sole job is to be with him, to interpret for him, to teach him. He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. And to teach me. Teach you? I need you to help me understand him, Damien confessed, the admission costing him visible effort. I can't do it alone. I've tried. I'm failing him. I'm offering you triple your current salary. You answer only to me. Will you do it? Elena stared at him. Triple the salary. A chance to help the boy she had grown to love, and a chance to work closely with the man everyone feared, who was currently looking at her with desperate hope. Yes, she whispered. I'll do it. The shift was immediate. The next day, Elena's desk was moved. She was no longer in the bullpen. She had a small, glass-walled office adjacent to Damien's suite, filled with toys, books, and beanbags for Leo. The dynamic of the 25th floor changed. Damien, Elena, and Leo began to form a triad. Lunchtimes, which Damien used to spend in power meetings or silent, brooding isolation, became active sessions. They sat around the low table in Elena's office. How do you say eat your vegetables? Damien asked one afternoon, holding a forkful of broccoli. Elena laughed, a sound that made Damien's chest tighten in a way he wasn't used to. Like this, she said. She molded her hand, tapping her lips. Damien tried to copy her. His hands were large, strong, and accustomed to gripping pens and steering wheels, but they were clumsy with the delicate language. Elena instinctively reached out, grabbing his wrist to adjust the angle. Softer, she murmured, her fingers warm on his skin. It's a fluid motion, like water. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through Damien. He froze, looking at her hand on his wrist. He looked up at her face. They were inches apart. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with business. He realized he wasn't just fascinated by the language, he was fascinated by the teacher. He loved watching her hands move, so expressive, so kind. Leo, oblivious, clapped his hands and signed broccoli yucky. Damien and Elena pulled apart, both flushing slightly, laughing to cover the moment. But the line had been blurred. They weren't just bosses and employees anymore. They were partners in raising this boy. However, not everyone was charmed by the new arrangement. Vanessa watched from the hallway, her reflection sharp in the glass. She saw Elena laughing. She saw Damien's softened expression. She saw them enter his private elevator together to take Leo to the park, a privilege even she rarely got. Jealousy, cold and reptilian, uncoiled in Vanessa's gut. This, nobody, was stealing her territory. It wasn't about Leo. Vanessa didn't care about the boy. It was about access to Damien. It was about power. Later that afternoon, Vanessa sat in her office, the blinds drawn. She was on the phone with a private investigator she used for background checks on potential hires. I need everything you can find on Elena Rossi, Vanessa whispered into the receiver, her eyes fixed on Elena's new office door. Financial troubles, ex-boyfriends, family scandals, anything I can use to prove she's unfit to be around a child. Meanwhile, in the sanctuary of the inner office, Damien approached Elena's desk. Leo was napping on the beanbag. Elena, Damien said softly, leaning close so as not to wake his son. Yes, Damien? She had started using his first name in private, he had insisted. There is a phrase I need to learn, he said, his voice serious, his eyes searching hers. It's important. Can you teach me? Of course, she said. What is it? Damien hesitated, looking at his sleeping son, then back at Elena. I want to tell him I'm proud of him, but I don't want to get it wrong. The city outside was weeping. Rain lashed against the 25th floor windows, turning the skyline into a blurred watercolor of gray and neon. Inside, the office was dark, save for the warm, amber glow of the lamp on Damien's desk. The frantic energy of the workday had evaporated hours ago. The cleaners had come and gone. The security guards were doing their rounds in the lobby far below. It was 9 p.m. Leo had been picked up by the night nanny an hour ago, fast asleep after a day of coloring and learning new signs. But Damien and Elena remained. They sat on the plush leather sofa in Damien's office, a space usually reserved for closing million-dollar deals. Tonight, it was a classroom. "Okay," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Let's try it again." "You're too stiff," Damien sighed, looking at his own hands with frustration. He was a man who could command rooms and navigate complex contracts, but his fingers felt like lead when he tried to speak this silent language. "I feel clumsy," he admitted, his voice rough with fatigue. "I don't have your grace, Elena." "It's not about grace," she said softly. "It's about intent. You have to feel the words in your hands." She shifted closer to him on the sofa. The scent of her, something simple like vanilla and rain, filled his senses, overpowering the sterile smell of the office. "Show me," he said, holding his hands out. Elena reached out. Her hands were smaller than his, warm and calloused from her art, contrasting with his smooth, manicured palms. She took his right hand. Her touch sent a shockwave through him that started at his fingertips and settled deep in his chest. "To say proud," she instructed, guiding his thumb to his chest. "You start here, near the heart." She pressed his thumb gently against his shirt, right over his beating heart. He could feel the warmth of her hand through the fabric. "And then you move it up, like your heart is swelling, like it's rising." She guided his hand upward in a slow, deliberate arc. "Proud," she whispered. Damien followed the motion, his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't looking at his hands anymore. He was looking at her face, the way the lamplight caught the stray hairs escaping her bun, the earnestness in her dark eyes. "And you?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Just point," she said. She guided his index finger to point toward an imaginary Leo, but in this intimate proximity, he was pointing past her shoulder. "I am proud of you," Damien repeated, the words unspoken but the movement clear. He let his hand drop, but he didn't pull away from her grasp. He let her hold his fingers. The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't the empty, lonely silence Damien had lived with for years. It was a heavy, charged silence, a silence that felt like a question waiting to be answered. "I never thought I could do this," Damien murmured, looking down at their joined hands. "After Sarah died, the silence was unbearable. Leo was just a baby. He would cry, and I wouldn't know why. And then, when we found out he was deaf, I panicked." He looked up, and the vulnerability in his eyes was devastating. The ICCO was gone. "I buried myself in this building, Elena. I worked 18-hour days because every time I went home, the quiet was too loud. It reminded me that I was alone, that I was failing him." Elena squeezed his hand. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say, "It's okay." She simply held space for his pain, just as she had held space for Leo's frustration under the table. "You aren't failing him anymore," she said firmly. "You're here. You're learning. That's all he wants." "I'm learning because of you," Damien said. "You brought the sound back into my life. No noise, but meaning." He leaned in closer. The air between them crackled. He could see the flecks of gold in her eyes. He could feel the heat radiating from her body. The professional boundaries that had separated them, billionaire and assistant, boss and subordinate, were dissolving in the rain-soaked night. Damien lifted his other hand, acting on an impulse he couldn't control. He gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jawline, his thumb brushing the soft skin of her cheek. Elena's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a second. "Elena," he breathed. He tilted his head. She tilted hers. The distance was close to nothing. His gaze dropped to her lips. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of her hand in his and the promise of a kiss that would change everything. Ding! The elevator bell shattered the moment like a hammer through glass. Elena jumped back as if she'd been burned, scrambling to the other end of the sofa. Damien straightened up, his face hardening instantly into a mask of composure, though his heart was racing like a chaotic engine. The elevator doors slid open. The sound of high heels clicking sharply on the marble floor echoed through the silent office. Vanessa walked in. She looked impeccable, as always, in a trench coat belted tightly at the waist. She was carrying a sleek takeout bag from a Michelin-star restaurant, but her face wasn't smiling. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the room like a predator. She saw them instantly. She saw Damien sitting on the sofa, his tie loosened. She saw Elena, flustered, smoothing her skirt, her face flushed a deep crimson. And she saw the space between them, the intimate, charged vacuum that only exists between two people who are about to kiss. Vanessa's gaze dropped to Damien's hand, which was still resting on his knee, the ghost of Elena's touch lingering there. "Working late?" Vanessa asked, her voice light but laced with venom. She walked over and set the bag on the desk with a heavy thud. "I brought you dinner, darling. I thought you might be hungry." "Vanessa," Damien said, standing up. His voice was cool and composed. "We were just reviewing some protocols for Leo." "Protocols?" Vanessa repeated, arching a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She turned her cold gaze to Elena. "It didn't look like protocols from the elevator, Miss Rossi. It looked personal." Elena stood up, grabbing her bag. "I was just leaving," she stammered. "Good night, Mr. Sterling." "Good night, Miss Vanessa." She hurried toward the elevator, desperate to escape the suffocation of the room. Vanessa watched her go, her eyes narrowing into slits. When the elevator doors closed, she turned back to Damien, a chilling smile plastered on her face. "You really should be careful with the help, Damien. People talk, and I'd hate for a little scandal to ruin everything we've built." Damien stared at her, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. The war had begun. But this was just a quiet skirmish. The real battle was coming at the charity gala. And what Vanessa was planning to do there wouldn't just humiliate Elena, it would put Leo in physical danger. Damien thought he could handle it, but he had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse in front of 500 cameras. The Sterling Foundation annual charity gala was the event of the season. It was a night of diamonds, black ties, and performative generosity, held in the grand ballroom of the city's most historic hotel. For years, Damien had attended alone or with Vanessa on his arm, leaving his difficult, personal life hidden away at home. But not this year. This year, Damien insisted Leo attend. He wanted to show the world his son, not hide him. And he knew there was only one way that was possible. "You're coming," Damien had told Elena 3 days prior. It wasn't a request. "I can't," Elena had argued, looking down at her scuffed sneakers. "I don't belong in that world, Damien. I don't even own a dress." The next morning, a long black box appeared on her desk. Inside was a gown of deep midnight blue silk. It wasn't flashy or revealing like the dresses Vanessa wore. It was elegant, with long sleeves and a high neck, but the cut was exquisite, draping over her frame like water. When Elena walked into the ballroom that night, holding Leo's hand, the transformation was total. She wasn't the invisible assistant. She looked like royalty. Damien, standing near the champagne fountain, stopped mid-sentence. He stared at her, mesmerized. Vanessa, clutching his arm, felt his muscles tense. She followed his gaze, and her smile curdled. The evening began smoothly. Leo, dressed in a miniature tuxedo, stayed close to Elena. She signed quietly to him, describing the chandeliers, the music, and the funny hats on the older women. He was calm. He was happy. But Vanessa was seething. She waited for her moment. While Damien was pulled away by a senator for a photo op, she cornered Elena near the dessert table. "You clean up well," Vanessa hissed, her voice low enough that the nearby donors couldn't hear. "But don't get confused, honey. You're just the paid help. Look at them." She gestured to Damien's circle of elites. "You think he respects you? He's embarrassed by you. He brought you here because he needs a babysitter, not a date. The moment this is over, you go back to the back office where you belong." Elena felt the sting of tears, her insecurity flaring. She looked down, her confidence shattering. In that moment of distraction, Vanessa made her move. Leo was sitting on a velvet bench nearby, engrossed in his sketchbook, his safety anchor in the overwhelming crowd. Vanessa swooped in. With a sleight of hand practiced in corporate boardrooms, she snatched the sketchbook while pretending to adjust her shoe. She slipped it behind a heavy potted palm. Leo looked up. His book was gone. He signed frantically. Book? Vanessa shrugged, looking down at him with feigned confusion. I don't know, Leo. You must have lost it. You always lose things. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the boy. The noise of the room, the clinking glasses, the laughter, the string quartet, suddenly amplified. Without his anchor, the sensory overload crashed down on him. He let out a wail. It started low but escalated quickly into a piercing scream that cut through the polite chatter of the ballroom. He threw himself onto the floor, kicking his legs, his hands flailing. The room went deadly silent. 500 heads turned. The whispers started immediately. That's the Sterling boy. Is he dangerous? Why did he bring him? Damien froze. He saw his son on the floor. He saw the judgment in the eyes of his peers. The old shame, the old panic surged up. He took a step forward but hesitated, not knowing what to do. Vanessa stepped into the spotlight, playing the martyr. Oh dear, she said loudly, for the benefit of the crowd. He's having one of his episodes. Come on, Leo. She grabbed his arm roughly, trying to drag him up. Stop this. You're embarrassing your father. Her grip hurt him. Leo screamed louder, thrashing against her, knocking a tray of champagne flutes out of a waiter's hand. Glass shattered. The scene was catastrophic. Then, a figure in midnight blue moved through the crowd. Elena didn't run. She glided. She didn't look at the cameras flashing. She didn't look at the horrified socialites. She walked straight into the chaos. She ignored Vanessa completely. She dropped to her knees on the marble floor, heedless of her expensive silk gown. She didn't grab Leo. She slammed her hand flat on the floor once, twice. The vibration traveled through the marble. Leo felt it. He stopped screaming for a split second, looking for the source. He saw her. Elena was right in front of him, at eye level. Her face was calm, an island of peace in the storm. She raised her hands. Breathe, she signed. Slow, rhythmic movements. She inhaled deeply, exaggerating her chest rising and falling. Leo's chest hitched. He stared at her hands. Look at me, she signed. Just me. The noise is gone. She created a visual tunnel with her hands, blocking out Vanessa, blocking out the crowd. You are safe, she signed. I am here. Daddy is here. The effect was instantaneous. The magic of being understood, of being spoken to in his own language, cut through the panic. Leo's breathing slowed. He scrambled off the cold floor and launched himself into Elena's arms, burying his face in her neck. She held him tight, rocking him back and forth, stroking his hair. She whispered into his ear, meaningless soothing sounds that he could feel as vibrations against his cheek. The ballroom was absolutely silent. The socialites, who had been ready to judge, were now staring with open mouths. They had witnessed a miracle. They saw tenderness, connection, and pure love. Damien stood 10 feet away. He looked at Vanessa, who was standing there looking flustered and cruel, her hands still raised as if to strike or grab. Then he looked at Elena, kneeling on the floor, holding his son with a fierceness that took his breath away. The realization was cold and absolute. Vanessa was the problem. Elena was the solution. He walked over. He didn't help Vanessa. He knelt down beside Elena and Leo. He put a large, protective hand on Leo's back and the other on Elena's shoulder. Thank you, he whispered to her, his voice thick with emotion. He helped them stand. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. They walked toward the exit, Damien, Elena, and Leo. As they reached the grand doors, a rogue photographer from a tabloid popped out from behind a pillar. Flash. The image captured in that split second was iconic. Damien, looking fierce and protective. Leo, calm in Elena's arms. And Elena, looking like a queen, her hand resting instinctively on Damien's arm. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Damien didn't let go. He placed his hand on the small of Elena's back, guiding her to the limo. The touch was possessive and intimate. It was a declaration. But back inside the ballroom, Vanessa stood alone, humiliation burning her skin. She pulled out her phone. She dialed the number of a reporter she knew, one who specialized in destroying reputations. "I have a story for you," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "About the CEO's new mistress, and how she's manipulating a disabled child for money." The next morning, the photo would be everywhere. But the headline wouldn't be about a family. It would be about a scandal. But the scandal was only the beginning. The mistake Damien makes the next morning, trusting his lawyers instead of his heart, would shatter his family into pieces. He thought he was protecting them, but he didn't know that his decision would force his son to run away into the dangerous city at night. The morning sun usually brought clarity, but for Elena, it brought a nightmare. She woke up to her phone buzzing incessantly. 42 missed calls, 100 notifications. Confused, she opened a news app, and her blood ran cold. There, on the homepage of the city's biggest gossip rag, was the photo from the gala. But the headline wasn't sweet. It was venomous. "The Gold Digger Nanny: How a Junior Assistant Seduced the Sterling Heir to Snare the Father." The article was a masterpiece of fabrication. It claimed Elena had stalked the family, researched Leo's condition to exploit it, and was using the child as leverage to climb the corporate ladder. But the killing blow was a grainy audio clip embedded in the article. It was Elena's voice, edited and spliced out of context from a private conversation she'd had with a friend months ago about needing a raise to pay off debts. "I just need the money. I'll do whatever it takes. It's just a game to them." The context had been about working overtime, but here, it sounded like a confession of a predator. By the time Elena arrived at Sterling Associates, security was already waiting. They didn't let her go to the 25th floor. They escorted her to a cold, sterile meeting room on the ground floor. 5 minutes later, Damien walked in. He looked wrecked. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. But he wasn't alone. The company's legal counsel and the chairman of the board were with him. The presence of the suits changed the air in the room. It wasn't Damien, the man who had almost kissed her in the rain. It was Mr. Sterling, the CEO, protecting his assets. "Damien," Elena started, standing up, her hands shaking. "You know this isn't true. That recording is fake. I never." "Sit down, Ms. Rossi," the lawyer barked. Damien held up a hand to silence the lawyer, but he didn't look at Elena. He looked at the table. "The board is concerned," Damien said, his voice flat and mechanical. "The press is camped outside my house. They are harassing Leo. They are calling him a pawn. So tell them the truth," Elena pleaded. "Tell them I love him. It's not that simple." Damien snapped, the pressure of the morning finally cracking his composure. "Perception is reality in this business, Elena. Until this blows over, I can't have you near him. It looks compromising." He was trying to say he needed to protect her from the mob, to shield Leo from the cameras, but the words came out wrong. They came out cold. They came out like he believed, even for a second, that she was a liability. Elena felt something inside her break. She realized that despite the shared lunches, the sign language lessons, and the moment at the gala, she was still just an employee to the board, and Damien was too paralyzed by his duty to fight for her. "I see," she whispered. The fight drained out of her. "You think I'm a liability. I think we need distance," Damien said, finally meeting her eyes. There was desperation there, but it was masked by duty. "Just take a leave of absence, with pay. Let me handle this." "No," Elena said, her voice trembling but firm. She pulled her ID badge off her blouse and set it on the table. "I won't be paid to hide. I won't be your dirty secret." She stood up. "I quit." Damien flinched as if she'd struck him. "Elena, don't be irrational." "I'm not being irrational. I'm being dignified." She walked to the door, then stopped. "Can I say goodbye to him? Please." Damien nodded stiffly. Leo was in the waiting car outside the back exit, guarded by security. Elena approached the window. Leo lit up when he saw her, pressing his hands to the glass. Elena fought back tears. She signed one last message, simple and clear. "I love you. Be brave." Then she turned and walked away into the city crowd, disappearing before Damien could chase her. The separation was immediate and brutal. The Sterling penthouse, usually a place of quiet luxury, became a tomb. For 3 days silence returned, but this time it was heavy and suffocating. Leo relapsed. He refused to eat. He sat by the front door for hours, waiting for the key to turn. When Damien tried to approach him, Leo would scream and throw things, his anger magnified by heartbreak. He signed, "Where? Where?" over and over again until his hands were tired. Damien couldn't answer. He sat in his study, drinking scotch he didn't want, staring at the empty chair where Elena used to sit. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that the peace he had negotiated with the board was a lie. He had saved the stock price, but he had destroyed his home. The office was no better. The 25th floor felt gray. He fired the lawyer who had spoken rudely to Elena. He yelled at the PR team, but it didn't fix the hole in his chest. On the 4th day, the silence in the penthouse broke, not with a scream, but with a panic. It was 7 p.m. Damien came home to find the front door ajar. The security guard was unconscious in the foyer. A vase shattered on the floor. Leo was gone. Panic, primal and blinding, seized Damien. He ran through the house shouting his son's name. "Leo! Leo!" He tore into Leo's bedroom. The bed was empty, but on the pillow, there was a piece of paper. It wasn't a ransom note. It was a drawing. It was a crude, crayon sketch of a large building with stone lions out front, and next to the lions, 2 stick figures holding hands. One was small. The other had a messy bun. Damien stared at the drawing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew that place. The public library. Elena had told Leo a story about the stone lions. She had said, "If you're ever lost, look for the lions. They protect the quiet places." Leo hadn't run away. He had gone to find her. Before Damien left the building, he had one final act of demolition to perform. He stormed into the security control room of the penthouse building. "Pull the gala footage," he commanded, his voice shaking the walls. Specifically the 10 minutes before Leo's meltdown. The security chief, terrified, complied. The screens flickered. And there it was, clear as day. Vanessa, looking around furtively, snatching the sketchbook, and sliding it behind the palm tree. The malice was undeniable. It wasn't an accident. It was an assault on his son. Damien pulled out his phone. He called Vanessa. She picked up on the first ring, expecting an apology or a reconciliation. "Damien, darling, you're fired," Damien said. His voice was deadly quiet. "You are banned from the building. You are banned from my life. If you ever come near my son again, I will spend every penny of my fortune ensuring you spend the rest of your life in court." "But the board," she screeched. "I don't care about the board. I care about my family." He hung up and smashed the phone onto the desk. He ran to his car. He didn't call the driver. He peeled out of the garage, the tires screeching. His first stop was Elena's apartment in Queens. He pounded on the door, desperate, sweat trickling down his back. "Elena!" No answer. A neighbor poked her head out. "She's not there. Saw her leave an hour ago." I looked upset. Damien cursed. He got back in the car. He closed his eyes and forced himself to think. Where would she go? The image of the drawing flashed in his mind. The stone lions, the public library. But Leo's drawing also had trees, lots of trees, and a bench. The park. The small, secluded park behind the library. Elena had mentioned it once during lunch. She called it her breathing space. Damien drove like a madman, weaving through traffic and running red lights. The city blurred past him. He wasn't the CEO of Sterling Associates anymore. He was a father and a man in love, terrified he was too late. He screeched to a halt near the library entrance and ran toward the small park tucked behind the massive stone building. It was dusk. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long, eerie shadows. The park was empty, save for a few pigeons. Then he saw them. On a wooden bench overlooking the skyline, a small figure was curled up against a larger one. Leo was there. He had found her. He was asleep, his head resting on Elena's lap. Elena was sitting there, stroking his hair, tears streaming silently down her face. She looked up as she heard footsteps. Her eyes were red, her face pale. When she saw Damien, she stiffened, her protective arm tightening around Leo. Damien stopped 10 feet away. He was out of breath, his suit rumpled, his hair wild. He looked nothing like the man who had dismissed her in the boardroom. "Elena," he choked out. She shook her head, putting a finger to her lips. "Sure, he's sleeping." Damien nodded. He took a step closer, then another, until he was kneeling in the dirt in front of the bench. He looked at his son, safe and peaceful. Then he looked at Elena. He didn't offer her a check. He didn't offer her a job. He didn't try to explain the PR strategy or the legal implications. He raised his hands. His fingers were trembling. He took a deep breath, trying to steady them. He looked her in the eye and began to sign. "I." He pointed to his chest. "Was." He moved his hand over his shoulder, indicating the past. "Wrong." He made the Y shape with his hand and tapped his chin, his face contorted with regret. Elena watched him, her breath hitching. She knew how hard this was for him. She saw the struggle in his movements, the lack of fluency. He continued, "I." Point to chest. "Need." He formed the hooked X shape and moved it down emphatically. "You." He pointed at her. Then he pointed at the sleeping boy. "He needs you." He messed up the sign for "needs" the second time. He fumbled, his fingers getting tangled. He made a sound of frustration, a guttural groan of inadequacy. He looked at his hands as if they were traitors. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't say it right. I'm so clumsy." Elena stared at him. In his frustration, she saw it. She saw the mirror of Leo. She saw a man who was trapped inside his own inability to communicate, desperate to break through. She saw the humility of a king kneeling in the dirt. The anger she had been holding onto, the hurt, the betrayal, dissolved. It wasn't the apology that broke her, it was the effort. She reached out and took his trembling hands in hers. She stopped his fumbling. "You said it perfectly," she whispered. Damien looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He turned his hands over, gripping hers tightly, anchoring himself to her. "I haven't finished the sentence," he said, switching to his voice, low and rough with emotion. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She waited. "I said he needs you," Damien said, looking from his son back to her. "And I need you. But that's not all." He let go of one of her hands. He raised it again. He crossed his arms over his chest, hugging himself. "Love." He pointed at her. "You." Elena gasped. The tear that had been clinging to her lash finally fell. "I love you," Damien said aloud, cementing the silent vow. "Not because you fixed him, but because you fixed me." The wind rustled the leaves above them. The city lights twinkled in the distance. But on that bench, the world was perfectly still. Elena didn't speak. She simply leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. And in the silence of the park, with the sleeping boy between them, the broken family was finally whole. The drive back to the penthouse was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the past week. It was a peaceful, exhausted silence, the kind that settles over a family after a long storm has finally broken. Damien drove with one hand on the wheel, his other hand firmly clasping Elena's. In the back seat, Leo slept soundly, his sketchbook clutched to his chest, his dreams no longer haunted by the fear of abandonment. When they arrived at the building, the doorman looked surprised to see Damien carrying his sleeping son, his suit jacket draped over Elena's shoulders. They took the private elevator up. As the doors opened into the foyer, the space felt different. The cold marble, the high ceilings, the museum-quality art, it all looked the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tomb had become a home again. Damien carried Leo to his room and tucked him in. As he pulled the duvet up, Leo's eyes fluttered open. For a second, panic flashed in his gaze. He looked around frantically. Then, he saw Elena standing in the doorway. The relief that washed over the boy's face was heartbreakingly pure. He didn't cry. He simply reached out his arms. Elena went to him instantly, sitting on the edge of the bed. She didn't need to say anything. She just held him. Leo pressed his face into her shoulder, breathing in her scent, verifying that she was real, that she hadn't vanished like the last time. He signed a single word against her back, his small fingers tracing the shape. Stay. Elena pulled back, tears in her eyes, and signed back firmly. Forever. 6 months later, the penthouse was unrecognizable. The floor-to-ceiling windows were no longer just frames for the city view. They were covered in sticky gel decals of planets and stars. The pristine coffee table was buried under a mountain of Lego bricks. And the silence, the terrible, lonely silence, was gone. It was a Sunday afternoon. The living room was filled with the sound of laughter and the soft rustle of movement. Damien was sitting on the floor, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, building a complex tower with Leo. No, not the red one. Damien signed, his movements fluid and natural now. The clumsiness of the park was a distant memory. He had hired a private tutor, waking up at 5 a.m. every day to practice so he could keep up with his son. Leo rolled his eyes, a gesture he had learned from Elena, and signed back rapidly. Red is stronger. Structural integrity. Elena, sketching on the sofa, laughed. He's got you there, Damien. He's the architect now. Damien looked up at her, feigning indignation, but his eyes were full of adoration. He abandoned the tower and crawled over to the sofa. He sat at her feet, resting his arm on her knee. The dynamic had shifted completely. He wasn't the boss. She wasn't the assistant. They were partners. They were a team who had built a language of their own from scratch. Leo, Damien signed, getting the boy's attention. Leo looked up from his bricks. Damien reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it yet. He just held it in his palm. Elena froze, her pencil hovering over the paper. The room went still, but it was a warm, golden stillness. Damien didn't stand up. He didn't make a speech about his wealth or his company. He stayed on the floor, grounded and humble. He looked at Elena, his heart in his eyes. He set the box down and raised his hands. Will, he signed, a future tense marker, moving his hand forward. You. He pointed to her, his finger steady. Stay. He brought his thumb and pinky down firmly, planting them in the air. Forever? He circled his hand in the air, a sign that meant eternity, a loop without end. Elena dropped her sketchbook. Her hands flew to her mouth. She looked at the ring box, then at Damien, then at Leo, who was watching with wide, knowing eyes. She lowered her hands. She took a breath. Yes, she signed. A simple fist, nodding up and down. Damien let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a lifetime. He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond, clear and bright like a drop of water. He slipped it onto her finger. He leaned up and kissed her. It was slow, deep, and filled with gratitude. In the background, movement caught their eye. They broke the kiss and looked over. Leo was standing on the coffee table. He was raising his hands high above his head, twisting his wrists back and forth rapidly. It was a sign for applause, the sign for cheering. He was beaming, his silent joy filling the room louder than any shout could. The camera pans out slowly, capturing the three of them framed by the window, the city below them noisy and chaotic, but their world is perfect in its quiet connection. In a world that never stops screaming, we often forget to listen, but they learn the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the loudest love is spoken in silence. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe that love is an action, not just a word, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Like this video so more people can find it. And subscribe if you want more stories that feel like this. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of your heart.